Rainbow's mind was filled with a wash of multiple emotions and feelings as she slowly woke up. Her wing was throbbing. Her head was burning. She began to feel dizzy as her whole body began to shiver. What happened? Where am I? Where is everyone? Just then, she felt her stomach churn as she tried to stand up. She tried again, but this time her body wouldn't allow it. She turned to her right as her stomach emptied its contents onto the floor. Every fiber of her body was burning as she spat out the last bit of vial from her mouth. She then heard a familiar voice approaching her. She couldn't see who it was or hear what it was saying. She didn't struggle as it picked her up. Careful not to touch her wing. She was carried through the room, which was still nothing but a blur as she tried to focus on what was around her. She felt disoriented. Her whole body was limp and her mouth hung open as she tried to breathe normally again. She was then placed on something warm and soft. Her eyes began to focus on her surroundings. She could see she was indoors. The floor was covered in debris. The wall was covered in bullet holes, and all the shelves of the room were empty. Shelves? She thought to herself. She squinted her eyes before she could see she was in a pharmacy. The color of the room, even the medical supplies on the floor. At least, it looked like a pharmacy, or a hospital even. Rainbow could see, now clearly, again. And she could see Sergeant Bishop in front of her, looking at the others as they patched Dixon up, who was still groaning in pain. Gah! Are you fucking done yet? Almost, Cole smirked to himself. Just one last... Gah! Fuck! Done. How are you feeling? Like I've been shot in the ass, you dumb fuck! Hey, Bish. How's she doing? Bishop turned around and placed a hand on her mane. Although she liked it, she couldn't tell him how painful it was, as he patted her head. I think she's coming around. Go on, Andy, make the call. Let's get out of here. Yes, sir, Andy said triumphantly as he rounded the room. Bishop then turned back to Rainbow, to see she was wincing in pain. How are you doing? Rainbow tried to speak, but she was too lethargic to do so. The sergeant smiles before putting a hand on her shoulder. Don't worry, it's the drugs. They do that to you. Rainbow Dash then began to look around the room. Her eyes scanned the area, and she tried to gain the strength to talk. We made it, Rainbow, Bishop said with a large smile on his face. A look which Rainbow Dash needed at a time like this. We made it to Norden. This room we're in was a hospital before the war started. We couldn't reach the other building, but we found a radio in here. Andy's going to call for some backup, and hopefully we'll be out of here by sundown. Rainbow Dash was getting her strength back again, and she squirmed around before she was on her stomach. The heated surface underneath her warming her body. She looked at the sergeant in front of her, before looking at his with a questionable look in her eyes. She opened her mouth, trying to push words out of her lungs. Hey, you should take it easy. You've lost a lot of blood. With one firm push, Rainbow Dash managed to force the words out of her mouth, but it came out more like a screech than a whisper. Why are you here? She said, feeling her vocal cords loosening, allowing her to talk again. What do you mean? Bishop asked, as he furrowed his brow. Why are you here? Fighting by yourselves? Bishop understood her question, but was hesitant to answer it. I'm sorry. I can't discuss that. Rainbow Dash glared at Bishop. He felt like she was being patronized. Can't or won't, Rainbow said with a slight growl. Bishop then stood up and walked towards his team. Rainbow Dash was surprised by his sudden change in attitude, but that only confirmed her suspicions that something was going on. Annie came back into the room, wheeling a large table with him, and on top of it was an old radio. Bish, I got a signal! All the soldiers instantly jumped from their positions towards Andy, and Bishop patted him on the back as Andy talked on the radio. I got us a signal to base. They're waiting for the captain to speak. The sergeants look at each other, and Bishop took the microphone out of Andy's hand before pressing a button to put the device on speaker. "This is Master Sergeant David and Bishop." "Bishop? Where's the captain?" "Captain Matt Finn John was killed in action 2 days ago." Rainbow Dash's eyes widened as her heart was the first time she had heard that the captain was killed. "Who's with you now, Sergeant?" "I'm currently with Private Andy May Clarkson and Sergeant Daniel St. Cole and Sergeant Adam Isaac Dixon and a civilian." "A civilian? Who?" Bishop looked at Rainbow Dash before turning back to the radio. "A prisoner we found in the place where Sergeant Cage was executed. She's English, and she's with us now. Injured. So is Private Andy, Sergeant Dixon, and myself. We need an evac. Immediately. We are low on ammo and supplies." "Hello? Hello?" Just the high-pitched scream came back from the radio before it went silent. Then a deep and throaty voice came through the radio. "Sergeant Bishop?" All the soldiers recoiled, shocked by the voice on the radio. The unmistakably German accent seemed to scare the soldiers. Bishop then stood closer to the metal box before talking into his microphone. "Who is this?" he asked before a laugh was heard over the radio. "Who am I is the least thing you should be worrying about, Sergeant. You came into our country. You spy on us and kill our soldiers. This is not your first fight, Sergeant. You made it our fight when you scratched one of our men. He was foolish enough to spy on us. This conversation's over." "No, it is not!" the commanding tone shouted. "You're going to listen to what I have to say. Where there is an action, there is a consequence. And you, my friend, you are going to know what happens when you fuck with our business. You're going to regret this." After moments of silence, Bishop leaned forward and turned the radio off. Nobody said a word as they looked at the Sergeant Bishop, who was staring blankly at the table in front of him. Later that night, Sergeant Cole was looking at Rainbow Dash's wounded wing, closely examining it as she winced in pain. The sergeant then reached back for the whiskey before holding it close to her wing. "What's that for?" "Clearing any infections. It's better safe than sorry." "I guess. Will it hurt?" "Don't worry about it." Rainbow watched as the sergeant poured the alcohol over her wound. She instantly gasped as the cool liquid strangled every exposed nerve in the wound, making her scream in pain. "Ah! You said don't worry about it!" "Would you have let me do it if I said it would hurt?" Rainbow Dash continued to grunt in pain before the agonizing sting slowly started to fade in her left wing. Cole then slowly wrapped it up before Rainbow Dash looked at it, saddened, thinking she would never fly again. When he was done, she pulled it from his grasp before cradling it in her forehooves. Tears began to well up in her eyes as she looked over her precious wing, devastated, like a mother losing her beloved child. "Don't worry," Dixon said, leaning forward. "I've seen much worse before." Rainbow's ears picked up. She looked at Cole with a strange twinkle in her eyes. "You're a pony doctor?" "What? No. I'm a vet. Well, I was. I've worked with all kinds of animals. Cats, birds, even fish." "Before the war happened?" Yeah. Listen, I'm really sorry about the pain we put you through. We was doing what we could with what we had." It's okay. I'm fine now. I'm alive, and I'm thankful for that. So, thank you. That's good to know. All right, I'm gonna get some shut-eye. See you in the morning, Rainbow." "See ya." Sergeant Cole walked off into one of the wards before climbing into one of the beds. leaving Rainbow Dash to think to herself, to think about how she ended up here. She knew now that what she was seeing in her dreams was real. She could remember it as clearly. She even cringed at the cheesy quote she said before entering the cave. Daring Dash? Really? She thought to herself. Just then, the blue box came back to her. She could have sworn that she had seen it before, outside the cave, but she couldn't figure out where. Tall, wooden, square, and blue. What was it doing in there? All of a sudden, she could remember what happened next. Rainbow Dash began to walk around the big blue box in front of her. As she circled it, she looked into the details, such as the windows, the doors, the odd blue light on top, and the white letterings on the top saying, Police Public Call Box. Just then, the light on the top flickered. She jumped back before walking closer. She walked towards the double doors in front of her, and she gulped before lifting a hoof and grabbing the handle. Her mind went blank. She couldn't remember what happened after that. As she squinted her eyes, trying to force her mind to remember what the heck happened that day, Dixon limped into the room. Rainbow Dash opened her eyes, looking at the wounded soldier, before she started trying to resist the urge to smile, knowing it would piss him off. Dixon gave a glare before hopping towards the ward where Sergeant Cole was sleeping. Rainbow Dash laid slowly stood for the first time, stumbling before she got her balance. She began to stretch her legs as she slowly made her way into the ward. By the time she walked inside, she saw Dixon, Cole, and Bishop already sleeping. Rainbow looked around the room, and she could imagine it was once full of nurses and busy doctors running around, but now it was nothing but a deserted skeleton of a building, holes in the walls and the floor from where explosions and shrapnel had done its damage. Psst! Rainbow Dash looked behind her. A yellow glow flickered against the wall. She looked around the corner to see Andy, who sat against the wall. In front of him was a candle, illuminating a book, surrounded by notes on the floor. Come here! Rainbow Dash walked up to the private as he went back to reading his book. Rainbow Dash sat beside him, looking at the book he was reading. She couldn't understand the writing, as it was written in a foreign language. What are you reading? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Found it in the library next door. It's called The Common Rogue, written by Marx Ludwig. How can you tell that? Oh yeah, you speak different languages. French, German, and Russian, to be exact. Right. Rainbow Dash went back to looking at the book, trying to mime the words. What does this one say? That one? Gesundheit. What does it mean? It means, God bless you, in German. Rainbow Dash paused before reading out the word again. Gesundheit. All this is making me sleepy. You look like you could do with some rest. Go on, get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay. Good night. Good night. Rainbow Dash walked back towards her blanket in the next room. She stopped, feeling nervous as she looked into the darkness. She then walked back into the ward before walking past Andy again. He watched as she slowly walked up to the bed where Sergeant Bishop was sleeping. Bishop? Bish? Rainbow whispered, but there was no response. She stood back before she reared up and jumped onto the bed, and still the sergeant was refusing to wake up. She slowly crept up to Bishop as he laid on his side. She nuzzled his arm, but once again, he was still deep in his sleep. Giving up, she lifted his arm before she crawled underneath, curling up into a ball, and shuffling close up to his body's warmth. Rainbow Dash sighed for the first time in weeks. She felt safe, like nothing could touch her again. After shuffling on last time to make sure her wing was as comfortable as possible, she looked through one of the holes in the ceiling, looking into the sky, and she could see the stars looking down on her. With one deep breath, she closed her eyes as Andy watched in the corner of the room. He smiled before returning to his book. What weak, inglorious fools we mortals are, that war must be, or any need of war. And yet the better day is coming, when the teachings of the lowly Nazarene shall be the rule of nations, as of men. The swords and bayonets shall be preserved by the fair children of a nobler race, as relics only of a barbarous past. Rainbow managed to have a peaceful rest, no sudden wake-ups, no headaches, and thankfully, no nightmares. For the first time in days, she had a peaceful sleep. She woke up, refreshed and happy, just realizing that she was still lying next to the still sleeping sergeant. She noticed it was still dark, and didn't want to disturb him after the stressful day everyone had just had. Trying not to wake him up, she slowly shuffled towards the side of the bed before jumping onto the ground. A brief moment of pain caught her off guard, making her stumble. She felt refreshed, but then an unpleasant smell filled her nose. It was her dirty coat. She gagged at the stench, but hadn't washed since she first woke up in this strange world. She needed a shower. Bad. She slowly walked out of the ward, looking at the sleeping platoon as she smiled. She had grown to like her new and only friends in this harsh world. Well, except Dixon, who she noticed wasn't in his bed. She looked around, but he wasn't in the room. She walked out of the large room, hoping to find a shower or a source of clean water somewhere to wash herself. She was never known for being that much bothered by her hygiene, but even she thought she smelled like a half-ton of compost. She turned right, walking into a dark corridor, and she was nervous and didn't like the thought of Dixon was out here somewhere, maybe even watching her. But just then, she heard something. She couldn't tell what it was, or where it came from, as it echoed through the corridor, but it was somewhere familiar. She paused, waiting for it to happen again. Then it did. She could hear it was coming from in front of her, and she slowly walked up the corridor, looking for the source. After walking a few yards, it got louder. She still couldn't tell what it was, but she could tell where it was. She looked to her left. The noise was coming from right behind the closed door, in front of her. She noticed a few bullet holes in its frame, and she walked closer to take a peek inside. After letting her eyes adjust, she could see a black silhouette inside. At first, she thought it was an enemy soldier inside, but then she saw the unmistakable bandage on his upper right thigh. It was Dixon. She leaned closer, noticing he was holding something square, a harmonica. He began to play a strangely gentle tune, which Rainbow Dash thought was odd considering he was such an aggressive being. He was stumbling around the room. A scent of alcohol hit her nose, almost making her eyes water how strong it was. She saw bottles scattered on the floor, and then she saw a picture on the table. A woman. Dixon then staggered towards the piece of paper before picking it up. He stared at it before grabbing another bottle. He smashed the top of it against the table and began to drink out of the broken bottle. She then let out a little sob. Dixon then grabbed the picture with both hands before ripping it in two, silently sobbing as he did so, dropping the bottle by accident. The sergeant grunted as the broken glass slipped out of his hand, cutting him deeply. He clenched at his right hand hard, despite the gash, squeezing blood from the wound. He then angrily shouted to the floor before he fell to his knees. Rainbow Dash backed away from the door. She felt sorry for him, despite the fact he was mean to her. She couldn't help but fall into pity for him. Rainbow Dash could clearly see he was in a lot of pain, both mentally and physically. She looked away from the door, wanting to help, but she didn't know how he would react in his drunken state. She turned back to the corridor, realizing she'd gotten sidetracked. She noticed a map of the hospital pinned to the wall. She looked at it, noticing most of it was either missing or burnt, but to her luck, she saw where she was, and almost all of the words were jumping out from the paper. She saw the word showers below the German text above it. After studying her surroundings, she knew where to go. She looked back one last time at the damaged door before she just walked from before she was carried on walking down the corridor. She still couldn't grasp how such a strong and arrogant man was reduced to crying in a puddle of alcohol. Did he lose someone he loved? Was it the person in the picture? She continued to think about Dixon before realizing she almost passed the room she was supposed to go to. She hopped back before opening the door, and she did it slowly, not knowing what was behind it. She saw 3 doors in front of her. Not knowing what any of them were, she instinctively walked to the one in the middle. Luckily, as she opened it, she saw it was the right one. There were a line of showers right in front of her. The sight was a huge relief for Rainbow Dash, as she could finally clean herself. She galloped as fast as she could to the first one she saw before she stopped, trying to figure out how it worked. The large metallic button was a giveaway, and she reared up before jumping, hitting the button with her hoof firmly. As she landed on the ground, she heard a loud bang, and it made her jump more. But more splurting noises came from behind the wall. She stood underneath the shower, waiting for the precious water. Bang! The shower pipes jerked before a brown, sticky mess was spat onto Rainbow Dash's face. Ew! Gross! She wiped away the slurry from her eyes before jumping to press the button again, this time backing away. The same happened again. The shower had gurgled before more of the brown mess was spread onto the floor. She frowned her eyebrows before running to the next one, but that also did the same one, this time completely covering her coat. After testing the other showers, Rainbow Dash found herself with the last shower in the room. Annoyed and completely covered in Celestia knows what, she leaped, this time slamming the button as hard as she could. The chrome button then flew off like a champagne cork, striking Rainbow Dash in her chest. The Pegasus flew across the room before landing on her head. As she grunted in pain, she opened her eyes to see water spraying from the hole in the wall. Like a man in a desert, she quickly picked herself off the ground before running towards the water. Rainbow Dash shivered as she stood in the cold spray, feeling her coat being caressed, her mane being washed for the first time in days. She hopped on the spot, moaning in relief as she washed off the dirt and blood, trying carefully not to let the water seep through her bandages. She started scrubbing the blood off her body. The stubborn stains took minutes to clean, but eventually she could see the blue in her fur, and eventually she was managed to see her cutie mark again. When she finished scrubbing furiously at her coat, Rainbow Dash sat on the wet floor, closing her eyes as she let the cool water pool down her body and into the drain.